I'm Sharon Stone. This is Engage from Central Florida Public Media.
Florida lawmakers filed a finalized budget on Tuesday, marking the beginning of the end of the second of three special sessions called following a remarkably unremarkable regular legislative session this year. Legislators are expected to vote tomorrow on its passage following a mandatory 72-hour cooling-off period between the bill's filing and the vote. The budget calls for increases in public school funding, law enforcement salaries, and a more than $500 million appropriation for Everglades restoration projects. Senate Republicans tout the budget, which is about $500 million less than last year's, as a restrained, balanced budget, with Senate President Ben Albritton saying in a written statement, quote, "We are holding the line on spending, living within our means, and striking the right balance between spending and saving." Democrats called the budget a missed opportunity, arguing it doesn't provide adequate raises for teachers, nor does it address housing costs or general affordability, as Senate Minority Leader Fentrice Driscoll stated during a Wednesday press conference.
It is unacceptable that this is the second year in a row where Republicans fail to deliver a timely, transparent, balanced budget that addresses the affordability crisis that so many Floridians are facing.
Joining us to parse out this budget proposal is Central Florida Public Media Politics and Investigations reporter Sam Stockbridge. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
Sam, the House and the Senate reached an agreement late Sunday night. They filed a bill on Tuesday. They landed on a figure for this budget just shy of $115 billion, a little more than the House wanted, a little less than the Senate had called for. Did they simply split the difference?
It's a funny question. I think, yes. I think when you look at a lot of the differences that there were in policies that Democrats had been pushing for, which obviously there being Republican supermajorities in each chamber, there wasn't really much that they had to go on. I think they were mostly in alignment on a lot of these things. I think a couple of points of disagreement mostly came between the Senate and the House. I think the Senate had, as you mentioned, a bit of a bigger budget. Not much, but a little bit bigger. But both of the figures that they proposed are a step down, a cut from what the legislature approved for the current fiscal year, so during the last session. But yeah, a little bit more free with money from the Senate. The Senate approved some money for the families of the Groveland Four. And, only $4 million, but the House was pretty universally more conservative with the money that it actually set aside for a lot of these programs.
And we'll talk about the Groveland Four in just a moment. Do you get the impression that this is a budget that Republicans in both chambers are happy with?
I'd say so, yeah. If there was one thing that I think there might be some consternation over, there's some lingering uncertainty that had been identified by a state audit over the state's school voucher program for private schools and charter schools. An audit last year found that there were some pretty significant problems with the accountability in the way that program was administered that made it difficult for money to be tracked from students and to kind of follow where the students went if they left a public school district and went to a private school district. There was findings that a lot of public schools were supposed to have money for kids that came to their district from a private program that simply wasn't there. And so the Senate actually had a lot of support for introducing some stronger auditing and transparency measures to have a better eye on how that money was being moved and managed. And that just wasn't in the House proposal. And ultimately, it ended up being left out of the final version of the budget. So I think a lot of senators felt that that was pretty important, and I think we're frustrated that that got left out. But for the most part, I saw a quote from somebody saying that, pretty much everyone left a little bit unhappy, which is about the definition of compromise.
Exactly. And despite the balk on that auditing funding, the legislature did allocate a record amount for education during this session.
Definitely. More than they had, although I know that House Minority Leader Fentrice Driscoll was definitely looking for a lot more money, and I would suspect pretty much every other Democrat in Tallahassee was also looking for more money for public schools. There's money in the budget for increases for corrections officers working at state prisons and state law enforcement, and they have had some difficulties in both of those areas maintaining employees, so they're thinking, maybe some more money will help with their retention. But ultimately, I think a lot of people were hoping to see more increases for state workers across the board, including for teachers and for school districts. And that just wasn't a part of the final budget, I think, to the degree that a lot of Democrats were hoping for.
Addressing the state's healthcare needs, the Senate had pushed for $30 million in funding for the state's Cancer Innovation Fund during the regular session. The House balked completely. In this special session, they agreed on $20 million. What was the House hang-up, and how did they reach this figure?
I think the hang-up was, as we mentioned, the House Majority Leader Daniel Perez had, again, reservations about the size of the budget, looking for ways to trim anything that could be considered fat. And I know that he had raised some questions about wanting to have a very specific idea of where that extra money would be both coming from and where it would be going, what programs it might be helping to fund. I would guess that the $20 million was probably a compromise intended to smooth things over with that which was a priority for First Lady Casey DeSantis. So again, compromise, a little bit of what the House wanted, which was to keep funding flat, a little bit of the priorities from the governor's wife, First Lady Casey DeSantis.
And Governor DeSantis has always been a supporter of Florida's wetlands. The legislature passed a colossal $514 million restoration package that would include the Everglades.
Yeah, that's been a longstanding priority for Governor DeSantis. In fact, I was just reading press releases from a few different nonprofits or Everglades adjacent agencies that noted that this is, I believe, the eighth consecutive year that he's asked for substantial investments in Everglades funding for restoration and improvements.
Are we going to see any of that programming in Central Florida?
That's a great question. It has been a sticking point, I think, for a few folks in Central Florida environmental protection groups, just speaking with our environment reporter, Molly Durig, that there's been some frustration that some of that money feels a little bit too tied to regions in Florida that are just a little bit too far south to really make their way here in Central Florida, even though we also play an important part in the water ecosystems that fuel the Everglades up here. So there's a case to be made that, we could certainly stand to see more investment up here in Central Florida too.
Sam, you mentioned the allocation for the families of the Groveland Four, those 4 African-American men who were falsely accused of raping a white woman in 1949. The 4 were pardoned in 2019 and exonerated 2 years later. What does this money acknowledge?
Yeah, that's a timely question, and I think a very philosophical one. That piece of legislation was sponsored by Democratic Senator LaVon Bracey Davis, who's from Ocoee, and she had a big personal stake in getting the ball rolling on getting a legislative acknowledgement of that. Before both the pardon and the exoneration in 2017, the legislature actually formally apologized for that case, what it called a gross injustice that those 4 young men suffered. And a big part of that was because a lot of what they suffered actually came at the hands of an elected sheriff for Lake County. My interview with her, she talked a lot about how that money is less about the actual dollar amount that they settled on, which will be $1 million per trust for each of the boys, but also it's about acknowledging and taking a step to move on and move past the state's role in this terrible miscarriage of justice, what was eventually found to be a lot of perversions of the judicial system in the way that case was handled and then proceeded.
Sam, you've covered legislative activity in Alaska and Texas before you joined us here in Central Florida. Did you see anything unique about the relationships or the operations within the Florida legislature compared to what you've seen in the past in other states?
Yeah, what's really funny is a lot of what I saw in the Florida political negotiation process for the budget reminded me a lot of actually Alaska. Ron DeSantis definitely has a very solid, very firm idea of what policies he wants to advance. But I think often it can be a little bit rocky to actually get those policies communicated effectively to the leaders of the House and the Senate without much competition or combativeness. There was a lot of disagreement. I think DeSantis voiced his frustration with Speaker Perez over his decision to essentially nix some regulations over AI and a couple of other topics from the special session on redistricting. And yeah, I think there's less of a great relationship between the governor's office and the legislature than there are in a lot of other states. And I saw that a lot in Alaska with Governor Mike Dunleavy there and the Alaska legislature, that I think often lawmakers would kind of be working on their own thing, and occasionally the governor would chime in and chastise them for not prioritizing his policies enough, but not a great warm relationship there to kind of help make sure there's a good give and take so that everyone's kind of on the same page and everyone can get behind something that they all agree on.
And just yesterday, Governor DeSantis ordered up the third of 3 special sessions to begin this Monday, the 1st of June, this one addressing the elimination of property taxes. Sam, what are you going to be looking out for?
What I'm going to be curious about is to see, as I was just mentioning, actually, how that working relationship between the governor and the legislature is actually going to manifest in the conversations that they have starting on Monday. I know that the House, pretty much everyone, Republicans in the House and the Senate and the governor have all said that they want to take a look at cutting property taxes, especially after, I think, some less successful efforts to rein in or to control home insurance rates in Florida. What I think is going to be interesting is that last year, state lawmakers, state Republicans, had proposed a batch of, I believe, 7 proposals that would have gone on the ballot to reduce property taxes in some way. And Governor DeSantis kind of criticized them for not being collected into one single ballot initiative. DeSantis is proposing one single initiative. It would increase the homestead exemption for primary residences. Basically, if your primary residence is in Florida, you can take $250,000 off of the value of your home before you calculate property taxes under his proposal. And that would need to get support from the House and from the Senate before it gets put on the ballot to get support from voters. But it's going to be really interesting to see if lawmakers have the appetite for the very specific vision that DeSantis is presenting on what he wants property tax cuts to look like, especially since they had their own ideas that he wasn't quite receptive toward last year.
Sam Stockbridge covers politics and investigations for Central Florida Public Media. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Engage is a production of Central Florida Public Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Richard Copeland is our senior producer. I'm Sharon Stone. You can reach us anytime with questions, comments, or story ideas. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Thanks for listening.